So this item, as you can see, that's on the agenda is a panel discussion called Doubling Down, Fragility, Conflict and Violence in the Face of Climate Change. The aim of the panel is to explore a bit deeper the different ways in which climate change manifests in fragile and conflict-affected settings, its different impacts or how it affects the communities living in those areas, and how it's maybe changing the role of humanitarian actors in delivering assistance. So to shed light on these issues, we have three excellent speakers with us here today. First, we have Ms. Janani Vivekananda, who is the head of program Climate Diplomacy and Security at Adelphi. I'm going to give very short introductions because otherwise I'm afraid I will never finish. They all have extensive CVs and bios. So Janani specializes in climate change and peace building, and she has over 18 years of work experience as a field researcher, practitioner, and policy advisor on climate change, peace, and security. Welcome, Janani. Next, we have Mr. Shashwat Saraf, who is a regional emergency director with International Rescue Committee, or IRC, in East Africa. Shashwat has a very long operational experience in the humanitarian sector, and he has worked in countries like India, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Somalia, Nepal, Jordan, Iraq, Nigeria, and I'm sure the list goes on and on. Our third panelist is joining us online. And her name is Ms. Cynthia Bakkalian. Cynthia is a disaster risk management project analyst at the Presidency of the Council of Ministers of Lebanon. Previously, Cynthia has worked as a deputy disaster risk reduction director for the Lebanese Red Cross, as well as a monitoring, evaluation, accountability and learning advisor for the Mercy Corps Lebanon. Welcome, Cynthia. The same housekeeping rules apply to this discussion as before, maybe just to say to those who've come during this time that the session will be streamed and recorded. Please be mindful of others when making commentaries, and in case uncomfortable, you can always reach out to our awareness person, Goda. But I will leave my own remarks to this and give the floor to the people that you're actually interested in hearing from. Our first speaker is Janani, whose presentation looks a bit deeper into the complex linkages between climate change, peace, and security. Janani, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Iida, and great to be here. Thank you very much, everyone. So I would like to talk to you about the importance of why, at the same time as building resilience to climate change, we also need to be building resilience to peace. And this is it crosses a lot of sectors, but I think it's particularly pertinent to the humanitarian community because the impacts of climate change are compound. But when we unpack them, when we look at what makes people vulnerable, we see that the underlying causes of vulnerability to climate change are very much the same or overlap hugely with the underlying causes of conflict and fragility. So climate impacts actually then, by extension, compound the drivers of conflict, and that makes peace harder to achieve, and that makes kind of climate resilience harder to achieve. So you've got this vicious cycle. But then the flip side of that is that by addressing those factors which make people vulnerable to climate, you're also, if you get it right, and you're doing this with conflict sensitivity, or we're doing this with an awareness of those drivers of fragility, those dynamics of conflict, there's a real chance of this double dividend. And I know that sounds kind of idealistic, but I will talk you through at least the conceptual side of this, and I think we'll then hear about some of the possibilities for this in practice. So I'd like to talk about how this is possible by setting out some of the evidence based on recent trends around climate peace and security. So I'll outline a number of pathways through which climate change impacts affect peace and security. And then I'll end with some thoughts about how we can address these. But to start with, I will just talk about why this is so important, not just from a kind of ethical and moral perspective, but also from a very pragmatic financial perspective. We're living in a world now where development and humanitarian funding is being hugely squeezed in Germany, but everywhere. But if we look at where climate, if we look at, I mean, what we see here is, and basically an outline of how climate impacts, yes, we know that they affect everybody, but they don't affect everybody equally. And if we look not at impact, but rather at vulnerability, if we look at those that are most vulnerable to climate impacts, and we take the top quartile of most climate vulnerable, we can see that over 70%, nearly 3/4 of these people, are also most vulnerable to conflict. So they're in the top quartile also for the most vulnerable to conflict and fragility. So what this means is if we're not looking at both of these things together, we really, well, if climate action isn't going to these most fragile communities, then we're not getting the prioritization right. Let me just give you another view. I know this is going to be quite small, but if we look at all countries, what you can see are all countries receiving peace-building fund financing. And I'm using PBF funding as a very loose proxy for fragility, because if you aren't fragile, you're not going to get peace-building financing. But it's basically showing us where the money goes. And if we follow the money, so all those countries from the red to the green receive peace-building financing, and the color code from red to green shows the most vulnerable to climate. And you can see that almost all of these countries are red and a couple are orange. So it shows that almost all countries that are receiving PBF funding to basically kind of ensure sustainable peace are also highly vulnerable to climate change. And so it shows us that we literally can't afford to ignore these these interactions, because if we start investing in fragility, if we start investing in building peace and stabilization, but we're not taking account of these climate impacts, there's not really much chance of sustainable peace, because climate is such a core part of this context. So let me then move us, now that I've made the case for why it's important, let me show you, I'll try to explain very quickly how. So I'll just talk you through some of these pathways. But yeah, very quickly, the first thing is that this isn't, I think, I don't need to say this in this room, but it's nothing that is kind of hypothetical or in the future. This is not something that we need to be thinking about now to avoid risks in the future. All the research shows that these risks that climate is posing to people's vulnerability are now, they're real, they're present, they're already taking place in many contexts around the world that I'm sure you're working in. And also, I'm not saying that there is any kind of direct causal link between climate change, peace and security. It's complex, it's messy, it's compound. So I just want to kind of state that to steer clear of that kind of academic argument about, you know, where's that golden thread from climate causing or triggering conflicts anywhere, because that's not how we see it. It's rather how does it interact and affect these pathways, and so these are the pathways. The first is that climate change impacts affect competition over natural resources such as land, water, forests. And the thing that I want to stress here, because I don't think this is new to any of you, the thing is that it's not about a shortage of resources. Often we think about scarcity, but it's not about the scarcity. What we see when we look at the research is that it's about understanding the way that climate change affects the access to and availability of natural resources, how it changes the political economy of a particular space, because it could be that there's scarcity, but it doesn't necessarily lead to conflict or violent conflict if there are equitable resource management structures in place. It could be that there's actually an abundance of a particular resource in certain places like Nepal, There's actually an abundance of water in certain regions because of very rapid glacial melt, meaning that certain communities have a lot more water than they usually would have. But this is causing conflict because it's entrenching existing inequitable water governance or water access structures, which means that certain identity groups, certain parts of the community have preferential access. So it's not about the scarcity or a shortage, it's about the way that climate impacts affect the availability, the access, who has access. And this is then about predictability of governance systems rather than about the kind of the hazard and the physical, kind of geophysical impact of climate itself. The second pathway, linked very much to the first one, is that climate change then has a very direct impact on livelihoods, particularly those livelihoods that are dependent on natural resources, so those in the primary sector in agriculture, pastoralism, fishing. And in these cases where people don't have alternatives that are more robust to climate impacts, people might look to move. So it affects mobility patterns. It's not always forced. It could be that it is another reason that feeds into people's rational decision to move, often from rural areas within one country to urban areas in the same country, in search of a more climate resilient livelihood. But very often when those livelihoods are not available, this can push people into illegal coping mechanisms, into kind of being pushed into the grey economy or the black economy, where there are very few protections for their human rights and well-being. We see kind of an increase in kind of recruitment into armed opposition groups or into criminality and organised crime, and it affects men and women very differently. So it's often men in many communities that are the first to leave, the sons or the husbands or the breadwinners in a family. But in some communities in South Asia, for example, it might be the women that will go to seek kind of domestic work in the Gulf, for example. So it's important to understand the differential way that this affects the different genders. I will skip through these, but maybe because of time, but maybe you can look at them at another point. They're just infographics that show those pathways. The third is, and probably the most visible in terms of the kind of the sparking of violent conflict, is around food, how climate affects conflict through its impact on food. And it's not then about food scarcity. Again, it's about what we've seen in the research is that the grievances come about when there's a sudden spike in food prices. So it's about the pricing and not the availability. And of course, these are very linked. But again, this is something that is governable. So when there's a drought or something that affects crop yields, that mean that there's a reduction in food supply, and that is coupled with the government removing a food subsidy, as we saw in just ahead of the Arab Spring, where there was the kind of the bread subsidy and the oil subsidy that were removed. It's that uncertainty around food pricing that can then contribute to violent conflict. And this affects also those countries that are most dependent on food imports because they're so vulnerable to food pricing. And this is then most of the MENA region. The fourth pathway is around extreme weather events and how that challenges governance, efficacy and legitimacy. So if a state isn't able to fulfill its basic requirement of ensuring the physical security of its people, then this can increase anti-state grievances. It can be politicized by opposition groups and kind of non-state groups. But then the other side of this is that when a state or a local governance actor is seen to effectively address kind of climate shocks and disasters, that increases legitimacy. And unfortunately, we're seeing this with certain armed opposition groups, such as Islamic State West Africa Province and Boko Haram in the Lake Chad region, who are providing kind of loans and kind of basically climate resilience measures, and this is increasing their kind of the community buy-in, the kind of hearts and minds of communities. And the fifth pathway isn't about climate change itself, but it's about our responses to climate change and how if we don't get them right, if we don't think through the kind of unintended consequences, if we do them in our silos and we don't think about the climate impacts of conflict responses or the climate and conflict implications of a humanitarian response, there's a real risk of furthering conflict and unintentionally increasing vulnerability to some of those other risks. I can go into some examples later, maybe in the discussion, but I want to just maybe leave it there and then hand over just so that we have enough time for a conversation. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Excellent, super interesting. I have already many questions myself, but I will refrain and I will give the floor next to Shashwat, who will tell us a bit more about what it is actually in these fragile, conflict-affected, vulnerable settings, how climate change impacts humanitarian programming, maybe access, and so forth. I will give the floor to Shashwat.
Thank you. I think the idea that I had was that I'll try and situate as to why are we talking separately about fragile contexts. I think Janani has done a wonderful job in terms of situating the problem as to why is it vital and why is it vital now for us to make sure that climate work fuses with humanitarian response. I think there isn't an argument now to make as to why should climate response and humanitarian response be separate. That's one. I think the second thing that needs to be situated is the fact that we continue to say, and we continue to hear the argument, how climate adaptation or climate mitigation work in fragile contexts is difficult and complicated. And I think, Dr. Abdullah, you mentioned earlier, in terms of how donors and others tend to stay clear of climate work in fragile contexts because it's complicated, it's expensive, it's difficult.
Yeah.
And I think it's again one of those myths that we need to break. And we need to establish facts by saying that if we don't, we will see the top quartile that you mentioned, Janani, a large number of people who are impacted because of climate crisis are doubly impacted because of ongoing conflicts. And if we don't, then we are basically looking at the remaining bottom quartile and we're not touching the massive needs of the top quartile. I think we need to establish, and I think there's enough evidence for us to continue to talk about the fact that there is only 1/3 of climate adaptation financing that goes to fragile context, even less. If we look at per capita investment in fragile context vis-a-vis non-fragile context, then we are actually talking about a ratio of 1:10. So we are basically saying that a large amount of climate financing programming happens at the lowest quartile of populations that are still far less impacted by climate, whereas very limited amount of climate financing goes to the top quartile of population that is not only impacted by climate risks, but also are doubly impacted by conflict crisis. So I just think that it's very important for us to look at some of the myths that consciously or subconsciously continue to be perpetuated. And I think we need to break some of those myths and establish the facts that are there. I will try and to put some flesh on the pathways that you talked about with some concrete examples from my ongoing engagement, particularly in East Africa. I've always wondered whether this whole thing about the intersection between climate and conflict, if this intersection is a coincidence, or if it's a correlation, or if it's a causation, as in if there is a cause and effect relationship. And I don't know. I know you talked about that we don't want to delve into causation, because no context works in a social and a political vacuum. We are working in a space which has its own social and political economy, and I think we need to recognize it. So the attempt in many ways to try and say that there is a cause and effect relationship, or we need to find that thread of causation, I think is a bit futile. We just need to see the facts that the problem exists and it does intersect. And what can we do to make sure that we can ease the burden and the fragility and try and respond to adaptation, but also the immediate humanitarian needs. So thinking about it, I started to think about the Horn of Africa drought. I'm sure everyone in this room has heard about the millions of people who were impacted across Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya. And the Horn of Africa drought is a very classic example of what we are seeing with respect to climate crisis. The frequency, but also the temporal nature, the longevity of each crisis as to how it's being stretched. Now, looking at the three countries we know that Somalia has been a fragile context for decades. We know that Somalia has a crisis, a conflict crisis going on for decades and is often labeled as protracted crisis, whatever that means, but a crisis that continues and continues. How was the drought and the impact of drought different in Somalia vis-a-vis, let's take Kenya, which is considered more as a stable political context, not a fragile context, not a context where you have the double burden of conflict and climate, but only climate crisis. And starting to filter some of the data that we were looking at, one thing that struck me was the fact that there was displacement because of drought that happened. There was displacement that happened in Somalia, in Kenya, and in Ethiopia. But the numbers were very different. So you had approximately 400,000 to 500,000 people who were displaced in Kenya and Ethiopia. And then you had close to 1.5 million people displaced in Somalia. And it begged the question as to why do you have a difference in terms of numbers? Is it because of the scale of livelihood dependence that Somalia has on pastoralism? Or is it virtue of the conflict that exists in Somalia? And I think if we look at it today, we will realize that a large number of people who moved in Somalia and self-identified them as internally displaced people are still in IDP settlements and camps in a lot of urban and peri-urban area, whereas the population that was labeled as internally displaced populations in Kenya and Ethiopia, especially in parts of Ethiopia where there isn't conflict right now, they have all gone back to locations, places where they were displaced from. So I think one of the things for us to understand and for us to unpack and constantly unpack as humanitarian actors or climate actors or collectively together is the fact that the impact and the effect and the choices that people make are very different in a conflict context vis-a-vis in a non-conflict context, even when you have the same climate crisis at the same time. You still have populations, millions of people, who are in Baidoa, Beledweyne, in various parts of Somalia, which are in IDP settlements, not because of choice or voluntary choice, but because of the fact that they were pushed to come to areas where they had access to humanitarian assistance during the peak of drought. They realized that in areas where they were, which were largely controlled by Al-Shabaab, were not accessible by humanitarian responders. And if they had to access malnutrition treatment for their children, access water and sanitation, access basic health services, and access food, then the only option for them was to move out and move to areas where you have access for humanitarian responders and they will be able to access those services. Which wasn't the case in Kenya. In Kenya, the reach and access was there for humanitarian responders. So the displacement was primarily livelihood nature or livelihood dependent, where you move with your remaining livestock to find pasture where you can, but not necessarily to go to areas where you have humanitarian assistance, and then you are not able to go back to your area of, or the area where you were displaced from, because of the fact that you will, one, not be accepted back in areas which are controlled by either state or non-state armed groups, because you did leave. And secondly, because you've already lost all your livelihoods and there is nothing to go back to. And thirdly, because you do know that you can access and get humanitarian assistance in urban and peri-urban areas where you have moved to. I would just like to give one more example, just to situate in terms of how conflict and climate converge and affect or impact people, is the Ethiopia crisis in Tigray, where you had a lot of people who moved because of conflict. And then, very recently, we saw drought hit the same very region, the northern regions of Tigray, Amhara, and Afar. And what it meant was that a large amount of arable land in Tigray, Amhara, and Afar was not, even in the wake of drought, populations were not able to practice agriculture because they had already been displaced because of conflict. And that actually led to one of your pathways, Janani, which you talked about, is the food deficit and the food productivity, local production deficit, and that actually leading to massive spike in food prices, thus in some ways perpetuating the very reason why conflict started in the first place, and how it became from a political conflict and started to turn into a more climate conflict. So I'll stop there, I'll pause there, but I just wanted to say that there are very clear examples, and we constantly see them around us as humanitarian responders in terms of how this has a double burden, and it actually puts a lot more and increases the fragility and vulnerability of the populations in these contexts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Shashwat. Next, I will give the floor to Cynthia, who has promised to draw on her extensive work experience in Lebanon to tell us a bit more about the types of climate hazards in the country and the importance of interagency cooperation. Cynthia, go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. So many thanks, Lida, for facilitating this super interesting sessions. So first, apologies for not being able to be present in person. However, look at the bright side. So I have definitely contributed in reducing the carbon footprint of the conference. So during my discussion and the session today, as you have mentioned, Lida, earlier, I'll provide an overview. I will take Lebanon as a case study, and I will provide an overview on the context of Lebanon, the different hazards, and here I'm focusing on hydrometeorological hazards, as well as the interagency initiatives that are implemented to come up with smart and durable solutions in the face of climate change. So for nearly 3 years, Lebanon has been hardly hit by the most devastating multi-pronged crisis in the modern history. The unfolding economic and financial crisis that started in October 2019 has been further exacerbated by the dual economic impact of both the COVID-19 outbreak as well as the Beirut port explosion in August 2020. So of the three crises, the economic crisis has had by far the largest and most persistent negative impact. So speaking of Lebanon's climatology in general, the country has a Mediterranean type of climate characterized by hot and dry summers and cool and rainy winters with an average annual temperature of around 15 degrees Celsius. So along the coastal line, summers are hot and humid with temperatures that might cross 35 degrees Celsius in August. But due to the moderating effect of the sea and so on, the daily temperature might range the range is narrower in the inlands. And in general, January is considered the coldest month with temperatures that might hit between 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. As for the existing hydrometeorological hazards that the country is exposed to, so Lebanon is mainly affected by flooding, droughts, forest fires, and extreme winter storms. So speaking of the floods, flooding poses a significant threat and an impact and has a huge impact on Lebanon. And events of flooding occur a minimum of once or twice per year and usually end up with devastating impact. So the estimated annual disaster losses caused by flooding is around $15 million. As for forest fires, around 16,000 hectares of forestry were completely burned and devastated in 2007. And in 2019 and 2021, we have witnessed a series of wildfires and forest fires in the country that have incurred serious damages and impacted the villages, crops, and the wildlife. Lastly, extreme winter storms have led to flash flooding, cold temperatures, and definitely heavy storms. So I'll just share my screen very quickly to visualize some of the maps that we have been working on. Can you confirm if you see my screen?
Yes, now.
Perfect. So in the respective maps, you will see the hazard mapping that has been conducted for, I took the example of 2 hazards, but definitely this is also articulated across the other hazards. in the National Early Warning platform that Lebanon has established. Speaking of the former, which is the flood hazard map, as you can see, the northern part of the country, as well as the inland, particularly the Bekaa Valley, which is the area in the middle of the map, are highly exposed to flooding. As you can see on the other side of the map, which is the hazard map for forest fires, the risk is considered very high, mainly on the coastal lands. And by the way, red marked areas are the ones that have a high exposure to forest fires. And that is to say the areas, as I mentioned, that are color-coded in red. So what I just mentioned is super interesting, and definitely having access to evidence, risk-informed data is very essential for us to have access to informed decision-making and so on and so forth. But what is Lebanon doing in this regard, and what are the efforts that are currently undertaken at a country level? As you have mentioned, Lida, I will be focusing on the interagency coordination that is currently being done in Lebanon. And here I will be focusing on three major actors: the National Disaster Risk Management Unit at the Presidency of the Council of Ministers, that is in charge of setting national level disaster risk management strategies, plans, and ways forward. The National Scientific Research Council, which is the academic arm for the government on scientific research and academia, as well as our partners, the Lebanese Red Cross, which is the national society working on grassroots community level initiatives. So I will be focusing on two major initiatives that we have started in Lebanon, which have and are yielding successful results. The first is the multi-hazard early warning and early action system, and the second is that of the anticipatory actions. So starting with the multi-hazard early warning and early action system. So according to the World Meteorological Organization, of the top 25 most climate vulnerable countries, 19 are fragile and conflict affected. And this allows us to illustrate the alarming intersection of fragility, conflict, and violence with the growing disasters, and here including the climate risks. In Lebanon, under the leadership of the National Scientific Research Center, and definitely through the direct support and involvement of the National Disaster Risk Management Unit, as well as the Lebanese Red Cross, a multi-hazard early warning platform has been established, referred as a NewSP, which role and aim is to work on tracking a series of hazards, providing early warning, and thereby advising on early actions. Moreover, and interestingly, in April 2024, this year, we have had a multi-stakeholder consultation meeting to present the early warning for all initiative within the context of Lebanon, and how each of the three actors are going to work on the four pillars of the early warning for all based on the global practices. And here I'm speaking about disaster risk knowledge, the hazard monitoring and forecasting, dissemination and communication, as well as preparedness and response capabilities. Again, I will share my screen for once and last to show you one of the dashboards that we have worked jointly. Okay, so this is an example of a dashboard that has been developed by the three actors on forecasting forest fires for 3 consecutive days. As you can see, the map portrays the areas that are at high risk, and these are marked in red, medium risk, those that are marked in orange, and low risk that are marked in yellow. So this is a very essential tool, and this dashboard is used for informed decision-making, whereby it is shared with representatives from municipalities, local communities, responding agencies, and so on, to support them in informed decision-making and to take preventive and mitigation measures. The last component I want to focus on, aside from the early warning system, is that in 2021, the Lebanese Red Cross, through the technical and financial support of the German Red Cross, has introduced the concept of anticipatory actions in Lebanon, which was adopted by the National Scientific Research Center and the National Disaster Risk Management Unit. At first, it started with forecast-based financing, and now we're referring to it as anticipatory actions, and it was completely unclear for us what do we mean by this. But just with a quick description of what this means. So initially, anticipatory actions refer to a series of actions that shall be taken to reduce the humanitarian impacts of a forecast hazard before it occurs or before its more acute impacts are felt. So we have learned through time that anticipatory actions in a humanitarian is a humanitarian approach that aims to save the lives and livelihoods and therefore reduce the losses and suffering of people. So prior to implementing the anticipatory actions in Lebanon, a feasibility study was conducted for weather and non-weather events involving different stakeholders, national and regional stakeholders in country, to determine what are the hazards that we want to work on and prioritize. As a primary step, winter storms were selected as priority hazards to be tackled, given their high impact as well as forecastable lead time. As such, an early action protocol was developed for winter storms, and therefore it has been tested and will be working on its evaluation in the upcoming years. As for the current year, heat waves were prioritized, requiring focused anticipatory initiatives. As such, currently, we have access to scientific data based on the Urban Heat Index, and currently, based on the joint coordination, community-level data is being collected on the perspectives of community members on the impact of heat waves, mitigation measures, and early warning. So we work on triangulating these different data sources. So to end my discussion, I want to focus on key lessons learned and recommendations based on what I have discussed earlier. So first, it's crucial to ensure interagency coordination and an integrated approach in addressing climate-related hazards, as demonstrated by the experience of Lebanon and the case study I have just mentioned earlier. So we know, and this is a matter of fact, that no single actor, regardless of their capacity or expertise, can achieve the desired outcomes alone. Second, all initiatives aimed at tackling climate change, such as the ones I have mentioned earlier, anticipatory actions, early warning systems, and so on, should be aligned with and supportive of national disaster risk management strategies, as well as plans. Because at the end of the day, each partner, be it a development or a humanitarian actor, can end up working in silos, but we are sure that this will not work and it will not yield the successful or desired outcomes. Last and third, financing agencies and donors should prioritize investing in anticipatory actions, early warning systems, and other initiatives aimed at mitigating climate-related risks, rather than solely focusing on funding response initiatives and efforts. This is it from my end. I will stop here. Over to you, Lida, and thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. And thank you all panelists for your great and, in my opinion, very complimentary interventions. I have some questions from my side to the panelists, so let's open the Q&A part of this session. I will give the audience, both those in present as well as the online audience, a moment to think up your own questions, and I will pose one question to each panelist from my own side. So from Janani, I would like to hear more about this last slide that you had on the importance of carefully planning and coordinating humanitarian activities to make sure that they do not aggravate climate change and negatively contribute to it. From Shashwat, I would like to hear more about the beginning of your presentation. You mentioned the lack of adaptation funding and some of the myths surrounding climate work in fragile settings. I wonder if you have any concrete ideas or any priorities that would need to be addressed for this to change and to improve, since we've been talking about the importance of collaboration and communication in this session so much already. So I wonder if you could pick up on that and tell us a bit more about that. And from Cynthia, I was very interested in the data that you shared, the various maps. And you've been talking about anticipatory action and early warning systems. I wonder to what extent you've managed to utilize, or your colleagues in Lebanon in general, have managed to utilize local knowledge and experiences in data collection, and whether they've had a chance to contribute. So I wonder if you could tell us some experiences related to that. Janani, go ahead.
Thank you. It's a great question, and I'll try not to offend.
I thought you would like it.
So I think the underlying challenge with humanitarian response, being able to adequately take account of people's climate resilience, and then linked to that, their ability to, those drivers of conflict and how they're linked, is the timelines involved, and it's a sequencing issue. But for me, it's not a real issue; it's a perceptual issue. There's an idea that first we save lives, and then we think about the other things, and this is very problematic because you save lives in the short run, and then one is actually undermining those kind of those dimensions of resilience that ensure that people can cope with the kind of climate risks that Cynthia was showing us in her slides. I'll give you a couple of examples, and I'm sure there are lots of examples in the room as well, and it'd be great to hear some if there's time. But one from Lake Chad, where I was leading a study looking at how climate change and conflict come together. And unfortunately, it was just ahead of the imminent famine in 2017. And there was a rapid kind of response. The early warning kind of systems kicked in. People could see that this is going to happen. You could see what happened in the Horn of Africa. And there was a adequate response from the humanitarian community. There was food aid provided and famine was averted. The donor funding lines enabled the provision of food, but not non-food items. And so what we then saw is that, because this is a region that is facing kind of over a decade of conflict, a lot of those affected by the impending famine were in IDP camps, and so they were provided with food, but no fuel to cook the food. And so you saw those communities going out and cutting wood for charcoal to cook the food with. And that led to widespread deforestation in a region which is already very arid and facing a lot of environmental degradation because of not just because of the natural conditions, but also because of the pressures of those displaced people on those communities. And so what we then saw is that in these camps, because they're relatively long-term camps, people were given space to make kitchen gardens and some small livestock like chickens and ducks to bolster their food security because of the deforestation, because of that direct response to the food aid that was provided. When the rains came, those camps were inundated and those kitchen gardens were devastated and the chickens all drowned. And when I guess the ducks could swim, but nobody really talked about the ducks. But then when the dry season came, the trees that would have been there to protect those camps from the winds and the dust storms, the tree cover had gone, and so then actually it was the dust that was more negatively impactful than the rains, and so those camps became unlivable, and some of those camps had to actually be moved. People could not live there anymore, and that was a direct response to the provision of food aid without fuel being provided. And talking to the donors in headquarters, they knew this, and they felt, they weren't happy about this at all, but they were entirely kind of bound because they said, well, all we can get from our national, the donors and within the humanitarian spaces, they knew this, but of course they need to get the okay from the Treasury, and they're like, well, we're allowed by the government, the national government, to give food, but nobody's interested in kind of oil and kerosene or whatever. So it's a really difficult structural problem. I'll just give another example of kind of the longevity of this as well. in Nepal, during the conflict, there was food aid being provided over a very long period of time, and people were given rice over maybe decades, I guess a generation. And this rice does not grow anywhere but the flat plains of Nepal. It's a hilly place, it's very dry, and rice doesn't naturally grow. But it's relatively food secure because people grow kind of the crops that would have been grown would be much less water dependent, things like squashes and gourds and other less water intensive crops. The provision of rice by the World Food Programme for so many years meant that when the conflict was seen to have ended and the humanitarian aid just stopped like that, right? It's just, there's no transition, it just stopped. And then the national government was under huge amounts of pressure because of the politicization of rice. Rice was then seen as what was expected, and if the government couldn't afford to then provide these communities with rice, and those it doesn't grow, the government was then being expected to, or they were buying it in from India because they couldn't sustain this in the once the WP had left. But also local farmers were just tapping the groundwater and drying it out so quickly because they were trying to cater to that consumption kind of expectation that had been created and locked in because of that provision of very climate insensitive food. And it also meant that when the government couldn't provide this, they couldn't afford it over a longer period of time, that created a lot of conflict because opposition parties could use this as a kind of political punch bag to show how the government doesn't care about you. But also, it meant that the local communities forgot how to produce what they used to produce. So that indigenous knowledge we often talk about was gone because of the imposition of something new. So, a couple of examples.
Great, thank you. Over to Shashwat.
So the whole idea of the big gap, especially in fragile context with climate adaptation, funding for climate adaptation. I think the challenge and the problem today is the fact that you have humanitarian organizations to respond to humanitarian needs. And then when it comes to climate adaptation and climate financing, then the approach primarily is state-first approach. And I think what we need to move away is from state-first approach to people-first approach. And I think that's very important and critical. Because till the time we don't have a people-first approach, we will always expect state to provide an element or a degree of peace before climate work can begin. And that continues. So that cycle and that vicious cycle continues, and we're not able to break it. So the aspect of people-first approach, if we put it at the center, we will make sure, and I think the donors themselves would then realize that we can work with peoples, with communities themselves, and be able to do climate resilience work alongside humanitarian response work, rather than waiting for the state to provide that stability and peace to be able to initiate climate adaptation work.
Thank you. Over to Cynthia.
Yes, thank you so much for your question. So essentially, local level experience is definitely key in framing the approaches and initiatives. That was the ones that we have discussed earlier, be it the early warning systems or the anticipatory actions. And with time, we have learned that scientific data on its own is not sufficient, and local level experience on its own is not sufficient. But the triangulation and the interlinkages between these data sources are what allow us to come up with data that we can utilize for building up our strategies and plans. So if I want to make it more practical and to share some of the examples, so within the context of Lebanon. So what we were thinking of is to come up with an early warning and early action protocol for flooding. And by default, one of the things that we are thinking and trying to unpack is whenever we want to establish the communication channels for early warning, community members and community perspectives have definitely to be reflected in our procedures and processes. Because that, again, we cannot establish a national protocol without understanding the preferred communication channels of community members, for instance. And this is one of the key, third essential pillar of the early warning for all, which is to understand the utilized communication channels and early warning systems that the communities might want and prefer. So even beyond the anticipatory actions or the early warning systems, if I want to go into more planning and contingency planning, I'm speaking about contingency planning. At a national level, we have our contingency plans for different scenarios, right? Be it displacement, be it war, be it forest fires, and so on and so forth. We know that these are very cliche national level plans that have to be definitely systemized and more practical at the community level. And this is why with our partners, and here I'm emphasizing on the Lebanese Red Cross, we are working on ensuring that local community contingency plans are established that are aligned with the perspectives and experiences of community members and match with the national contingency planning. So these are the few examples that I can share. Definitely, if time allowed, I can share more examples. Over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Now I would like to invite the audience to pose any questions. I think we have one question online, then we have here in the front row and in the back. Darina, can you share the question from online?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you to the panel for this very interesting discussion so far. I have one comment and question from Patrick Kamadi from Humanitarian, Germany. First of all, he fully agrees with the pathways that Janani presented, but he still sees a massive weakness in the current corrective initiatives that address these pathways. So to his opinion, the mentioned players in the context continue, but however, in a slightly modified business as usual. So there are still, for example, in Sudan, resources that flow out of the country and are not used in the country. He also mentions Myanmar as an example. And so his question would then be, how can we include and engage the private sector in addressing climate-induced fragility and crisis? So that's all from the online audience.
Good, thank you. Sounds like this was maybe a question to Janani. Shall we take a couple more questions and then we address them as a bunch? Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm Florian Westphal from Save the Children Germany. Thanks a lot for your contributions. I just want to look a bit more at the environment within which this interaction between humanitarian actors and climate actors happens. And the state has come up on a number of occasions. The state both as a donor, but also the state in the places we're talking about here. But until now, don't get me wrong, but it feels a little bit as if the state's been treated fairly neutrally, as if it was just there and it was fundamentally benevolent, which, as we know, it is generally not, especially in fragile situations and conflicts. The state typically is an actor in this conflict. And so it will very deliberately go about manipulating access to resources, typically including to humanitarian aid, according to its own interests. So I'm just wondering, is there a prospect that these two different groups of actors, humanitarian actors and organizations that focus more on what I think, by the way, we should call the climate crisis, not climate change, but anyway, work together to actually try and develop some effective advocacy, so to make sure that political decisions are taken that do not harm people's access either to humanitarian aid or to a sustainable livelihood. I was thinking your example from Somalia, why can people only access aid in various cities and locations which are controlled by the government? I mean, those are political choices on all sides of that conflict, that it's only possible there. They're not taken in the interest of the affected people. So I'm just wondering, is there space for working together to actually try and have an impact on government decisions in the concerned countries, but also then obviously on donor governments?
Thank you. Marcus.
Sorry, my name is Marcus Geisser from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Sort of just in following the question that our colleague from SAFE asked, I was really inspired by your comment, our colleague from IRC, about focusing from state-centric to people-centric. And a lot of organizations that are present and individuals in this room have, of course, worked very tirelessly to actually make that happening. And the last COP, at least we have now the COP28 declaration on peace and recovery, fragility. Well, at least it's in a declaration, but it's not in the negotiation text, of course. Now, quite concretely, the role of states, such as Germany, in the international climate foreign policy pace. Imagine you have a meeting next week with Jennifer Morgan. What would be your 3 points that you would like to raise? Jennifer Morgan is the Secretary of State and the German Special Envoy for climate change or climate crisis. Thanks.
Thank you. Would you like to start by taking the online question, maybe? And shall we take one more? Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Tatiana Stavnici. I'm from Caritas Ukraine. I'm a guest of Caritas Germany these days. It was so interesting for me. Also, I want to go back to this question of people-centric. And the thing that spoke to me actually in all three of the presentations was the question of bringing the local voice to the table, to decision-makings from the very beginning, and that how that could actually affect and improve both the questions of humanitarian aid and its logic, and also the questions of climate change. So maybe in that direction of localization, I'd be interested to hear some of your thoughts, because it seemed to be like a thread that was begging part of the solution. Thank you.
Good, go ahead.
Good. Thank you so much for the questions. Very, really insightful questions and good to get into the meat of things. I think I'll start with the scope or the point about the state being benevolent or not, and I think that links very much to the localization piece. I think so. I've worked on both sides of this divide. At the moment, I'm a lot more on the kind of public policy support, working with some of the national governments in country, but also on the donor side. I think, to be very frank, the scope for advocacy from the community, like the humanitarian and peace building and development community, isn't necessarily the strongest. I think, to be very clear-sighted about it, the question about the role of the private sector, that is the voice that will have the most leverage. So if there's a business case to be made for private sector actors on the need for them, not because of the goodness of their hearts, but because it will affect their bottom line, to be both conflict sensitive. There's a lot of work around this about the value of conflict sensitive business practice for businesses as well as for communities, but also to be more climate risk informed, not just in terms of safeguarding their assets from climate, but also about being aware of what happens when they have these contracts with the national government that divert water or land or the kind of the raw materials to their production sites over communities, and how that creates conflict. So it's then there's a clear business case for addressing communities' climate resilience or climate vulnerabilities. There, I think there's the strongest lever, because I don't think this isn't the community that will sway the opinions of national governments, either on the donor side or the recipient side. We see that there's, in the current geopolitical climate, the West is no longer this kind of power holder. There's not that leverage. If I heard the Kenyan president say very articulately, when the UK comes to talk to us, they give me a lecture, and when the Chinese come to talk to me, they give me a hospital. So if there is this kind of conditionality pushed through development and humanitarian kind of aid. There's so many other options now. You as a fragile state, as a rogue state, as a state that doesn't care so much about its people, if you are being held to account through the provision of or the conditionality of aid, what we're seeing is a no thank you, we'll go to the Gulf, or we'll go to China, or we'll go to Russia. There are other options. So I think we should be very pragmatic about that and see like what is really the best use of our time and energy. And I think that the point about localization is very, very important. But it's also important that it's not kind of supplanting the need of national government, because in these contexts, I don't think I was speaking benevolently about some of these national governments. It is the absence of governance that that underpins the vulnerability of these communities in the Lake Chad region, and it is the provision of governance by non-state actors now, things like these terrorist groups, that is addressing those vulnerabilities, because the government isn't doing that. But if we just focus on kind of local participation and local solutions, we're not building any prospect for sustainable peace, because you need a state, you need a functioning state. So I think you do need the two in parallel, and you do need diplomacy and kind of foreign policy alongside that localized humanitarian action. And for me, I think it's about ensuring those the realities and the day-to-day realities of people affected by these issues are reflected in the analysis that feeds up to the policy. And not sure that you need that, farmer at the table in the COP negotiations, but those realities need to be are reflected in the research and the analysis that then feed in. That's probably quite a controversial position, but I'll stand by it for now.
Thank you.
So I don't know, probably I'll ask the Secretary of State to give 2 hospitals and not a lecture. I don't know if that would work, but no, I still feel that in the end, a lot of work that needs to happen, and the lot of push has to be around people and people's agency. And I think we have failed. We have failed miserably in many ways, whether it's as humanitarian organizations or development organizations, or whatever silos that we put in ourselves into. We have failed in ensuring that there is that voice and agency. And I think that's where probably the focus has to be. From the German government, from all of us in this room, if we have to, if we don't want to see the fact that today in East Africa, we talk about 50.1 million people who are in IPC 3+, and that this, by the year 2030, will become some 65 million plus. I think we constantly are looking at numbers and forecasting numbers in terms of how I was reading this number as to how today in East Africa alone, there are about 1.8 million climate refugees. I don't know how that label comes and how we calculate 1.8 million as climate-specific refugees. But it did say that by the year 2030 or 35, there will be anywhere between 8 to 10 million climate refugees only in East Africa. So I still feel that the whole approach has to be about people's voice and people's agency. And I think collectively, whether we are with a blue sticker or a brown sticker or a yellow sticker, that needs to be the focus for us to have that advocacy, or for people themselves to be able to advocate that we will not move to Baidoa or Beledweyne to access humanitarian assistance. In case of drought, we need that assistance to be in areas where we are, rather than be displaced to areas where we don't want to move to. and I think it's not only the state, it's also the plethora of non-state armed groups that are there, that play that role, who are not benevolent themselves, as in, so both state and non-state armed groups. And I don't think NGO voice or humanitarian organizations, even local organizations, would be able to influence until unless there is people themselves who have that voice and agency to influence both state and non-state actors.
Thank you. Now I give the word to Cynthia.
Yes, I guess I will tap upon the last question on the importance and the need for localization, although this was, I guess, quite well emphasized during the panel today. So I just want to reflect on my experience before I left the Lebanese Red Cross as a Deputy Disaster Risk Reduction Director. So one of the things we used to essentially do is, as part of understanding local perspectives and community insights on vulnerabilities, risks, and so on, is to conduct what we refer to as the vulnerability and capacity assessment, which is a Red Cross, Red Crescent tool that we utilize to make sure that community voices are embedded in disaster risk management planning. And during this process and approach, what we used to do is to understand from the perspective of the community the different types of risks and vulnerabilities that they are exposed to, and to make sure that all actions and initiatives that are done are actually aligned with the concerns of the communities. And by the way, whenever I'm referring to communities, it doesn't only incorporate and include community members per se. It also includes interlocutors, it includes influencers, it includes municipal personnel, it includes local grassroots organizations. So we made sure to sit and discuss with all of these groups within the community and to come up with initiatives and solutions that match with the needs and concerns and perspectives of the communities. So this is from an action planning perspective, but even whenever we used to implement any community level projects that aim at mitigating or preventing existing risks within the community context, community members were usually consulted through qualitative data collection approaches to make sure that whatever is being implemented is what the community needs. I mean, the concept of localization, we're just recently hearing about localization and the need of localization and how organizations, be it development and humanitarian, should embed localization within its programming. But a lot of organizations, and here I'm focusing on local community organizations, were even doing localization before this term was actually very public and very well known. Over to you.
Thank you. I hate to interrupt an interesting conversation. I'm sure there's a lot to say. Luckily, there's a long half-an-hour break for us to continue the conversation. Before we start that break, I will do one more round of questions among the panelists. We can call it a lightning round, since we're out of time. And I would just like to ask each panelist to identify one thing, an idea, a key finding, a message that you would like the audience to take home from this discussion. Say in under 10 words. Extra challenge.
Starting with me.
Sure, go ahead.
For me, it's about moving the concept of do no harm. It's been there in the humanitarian space when it comes to conflict, but let's understand this more broadly in terms of climate and security risks. So when we're thinking about the whole project management cycle of doing a humanitarian response, think beyond just that immediate humanitarian need to actually understand those contextual factors and the ways that climate and security risks will affect the long-term possibilities. So I think it's about integrating that understanding of what makes people vulnerable to both climate and security risks, and how can we do no harm to those, and what actually makes them resilient, and can we actually enhance those? So my one ask as a takeaway is, when thinking about how you measure the effectiveness and your impact, it's not then simply like how many children did we feed in a school feeding program, or how many people did we resettle, or vaccinations did we give, but actually understanding the impact of some of these on that climate and security resilience, to then measure the impact on those as well, to ensure that do no harm is being locked into programming.
Thank you. Shashwat.
Political stability is important, but it is not a prerequisite and an essential requirement for working on climate mitigation and adaptation in fragile contexts.
Cynthia.
So my take-home message would be, I have already highlighted this as a recommendation during my discussion, but I want to reiterate and refocus on that message, which is a message to financing agencies and donors in terms of prioritizing initiatives that essentially aim at mitigating climate-related risks and not only focusing to response initiatives, because we know at the end of the day, we're mostly response-oriented and we tend to be more active during times of response, but we rarely think of times of anticipation or prevention or mitigation. Thank you, and over.
Thank you very much. Let's end the conversation here. Let's give a big round of applause for our panelists.